He thought she was just another nervous applicant waiting for the same job. He had no idea he was about the biggest assumption of his career. He gave her interview advice. She let him keep talking. She already knew exactly how this story was about to end.
Now just stay calm. Don't let them rattle you. You've got this.
The nervous applicant from the lobby just sat down on the other side of the table. And she wasn't nervous at all. He could have panicked. Instead, he did something most people never do. He told the truth, even to the boss he didn't know he'd already met.
If you've ever said something honest before realizing exactly who you were talking to, stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happened in that conference room proves that sometimes the most embarrassing moment of your life can turn into the best thing that ever happened to you. And if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what's coming. Marcus Reed had interviewed for 11 jobs in the past 4 months, and 11 times he'd driven home replaying every answer he'd given, wondering which specific sentence had cost him the position. He was 38 years old, a single father to a 9-year-old daughter named Maya, and he'd been laid off from his logistics coordinator role 8 months earlier when the regional distribution company he'd worked for nearly a decade quietly consolidated 3 departments into one and eliminated his position along with 40 others in a single afternoon email. Marcus's wife, Denise, had passed away 3 years earlier from a sudden cardiac condition nobody had seen coming, leaving him to raise Maya entirely alone through the hardest stretch of both their lives. He'd managed, somehow, holding steady employment and a stable home for her right up until the layoff turned his careful stability into something far more precarious. Severance had covered 4 months of expenses. Unemployment covered less than that. By the time Marcus arrived for his 12th interview on a bright Tuesday morning at Halden Innovations, a rapidly growing tech logistics startup 2 floors up in a downtown high-rise, he was down to careful grocery budgeting and quiet, private anxiety about the mortgage payment due in 11 days. He'd prepared obsessively for this particular interview, researching Halden Innovations late into the previous 3 nights after Maya went to bed, memorizing the company's recent funding round, its supply chain optimization platform, even the names of its department heads as listed on the company website, though notably absent from that leadership page was any photo or biography of the company's CEO, a detail Marcus hadn't thought much about beyond mild curiosity. He arrived 20 minutes early, as he always did, dressed in his one remaining interview-appropriate blazer, slightly worn at the elbows but carefully pressed the night before. A thin folder of printed resumes and reference letters tucked under one arm. The waiting area outside Halden's 12th floor offices was sleek and modern, all glass walls and soft natural light. A row of leather chairs arranged near a small reception desk currently unattended, the receptionist apparently stepping away momentarily. Marcus settled into a chair, running through his prepared talking points one final time in his head, when a young woman walked in and took the seat beside him, casually dressed in a gray sweater and jeans, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a simple canvas tote bag over one shoulder, looking, to Marcus's eyes, exactly like someone nervously waiting for the very same interview slot he assumed they were both competing for. She smiled at him, a warm, slightly nervous-looking smile, and Marcus, driven by some combination of genuine kindness and the particular camaraderie that forms between strangers facing a shared ordeal, smiled back. "First time interviewing here too?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low and friendly. The woman, whose name, though Marcus didn't yet know it, was Whitney Sinclair. Glanced at him with quiet amusement dancing behind otherwise composed eyes. "Something like that," she said carefully, a small private smile tugging at her mouth that Marcus entirely misread as nervous energy rather than genuine amusement. "You look pretty calm about it," Marcus continued, encouraged by what he assumed was a fellow anxious applicant. "Take it from someone on interview number 12 here. The panel wants you to relax more than you think they do. Half of getting hired is just not looking like you're about to pass out in the chair." Whitney laughed softly, a real laugh this time, quickly stifled behind one hand. "That's actually good advice," she said, and Marcus, feeling a small surge of confidence at having apparently helped calm a fellow nervous candidate, kept going, unaware he was digging himself deeper into an assumption that would define the next 20 minutes of both their lives. "Also," he added, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "don't oversell yourself in the first 5 minutes. I did that in my 3rd interview, and it came across way too eager. Just answer honestly, let them ask follow-ups, and don't be afraid of a little silence while you think. Honest answers, Whitney repeated slowly, nodding as though genuinely filing the advice away. I can do that. She studied Marcus for a moment longer, something curious and warm in her expression that he entirely failed to notice, too focused on his own nervous energy to register anything unusual about the exchange. What position are you interviewing for? She asked. Logistics operations manager, Marcus said. I've got almost a decade of experience coordinating regional distribution, though. The last 8 months have been a rough stretch since my old company restructured. You? Whitney paused for just a fraction of a second longer than a simple answer required. Let's just say I'm here to evaluate the same role you're interviewing for, she said carefully. A statement. That was, in fact, entirely true, though Marcus interpreted it as confirmation she was applying. For the exact position he wanted, a small competitive worry flickering through him that he quickly pushed aside, reminding himself that worrying about another candidate's chances wouldn't improve his own. They continued talking for the better part of 15 minutes, while the receptionist remained conspicuously absent, Marcus offering increasingly candid observations about the interview process, about Halden Innovation's public reputation for treating employees well despite rapid growth, about his own genuine excitement for the role despite the financial pressure driving his urgency. At one point, prompted by Whitney's gentle, curious questions, Marcus found himself talking openly about Maya, about the challenge of rebuilding financial stability as a single father, about how badly he needed this particular opportunity to work out, details he wouldn't normally volunteer to a stranger in a waiting room, but somehow felt natural sharing with someone he believed was facing the exact same uncertain morning he was. You mentioned your last company restructured you out, Whitney said eventually, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more precisely attentive rather than merely friendly. What do you think companies get wrong when they handle layoffs like that? Marcus considered the question seriously, appreciating what he assumed was simply a fellow candidate practicing interview conversation. Communication, mostly, he said. They told 40 of us in a single email, no individual conversations, no real explanation beyond position eliminated. People deserve to be told things to their face by someone who actually knows their work, not through a form letter. I promised myself if I ever managed people again, I'd never let a layoff happen that way. A door opened down the hallway and a young assistant appeared, glancing between the two of them with faint visible confusion before addressing Whitney directly. Ms. Sinclair, the conference room is ready whenever you'd like to begin. Marcus felt the floor tilt slightly beneath the moment, his brain working rapidly to reconcile the assistant's words with 20 minutes of assumptions he'd been building since Whitney sat down beside him. Ms. Sinclair? He repeated slowly, something cold and mortified beginning to spread through his chest. Whitney rose from her chair, adjusting her tote bag over one shoulder, the same warm, faintly amused expression from earlier still present, though now carrying an edge of genuine curiosity about how Marcus would handle the next several minutes. Whitney Sinclair, she said, extending her hand properly for the first time. I'm the CEO of Halden Innovations. I'll be conducting your interview this morning, Marcus. Marcus stood too quickly, nearly knocking his resume folder off his lap, a wave of pure mortification washing over him as he replayed, in rapid, horrified succession, every candid, unfiltered thing he'd said over the past 20 minutes to the very person deciding whether he'd be able to make his mortgage payment in 11 days. I am so sorry, Marcus said immediately, heat rising in his face. I had absolutely no idea I thought €1. Whitney held up a hand gently, cutting off the apology before it fully formed. Marcus, walk with me to the conference room, she said, her tone calm and entirely unbothered. We have a lot to talk about, and none of it needs an apology. The walk down the hallway felt endless to Marcus, his mind racing through damage control scenarios, wondering whether honesty about a stranger's advice-giving faux pas could possibly recover from itself, wondering whether he'd just talked himself out of the one opportunity standing between his family and real financial trouble. Whitney, walking calmly beside him, seemed entirely unfazed, occasionally glancing sideways at him with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. They settled into the same sleek conference room Marcus had glimpsed from the hallway during his research the previous evening, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city's skyline in bright midday light. Whitney took her seat across the glass table, sliding a small nameplate into position that Marcus hadn't noticed the assistant had prepared. Whitney Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer, the words landing with fresh, undeniable weight now that he understood their full context. "Let's address the obvious thing first," Whitney said, folding her hands on the table, her tone shifting into something more genuinely serious now that the formal interview had technically begun. "You gave the CEO interview advice for 20 minutes without knowing who she was. I'd understand if you're feeling embarrassed right now." Marcus took a slow breath, deciding in that moment, with genuine courage, he wasn't entirely sure he possessed until he heard himself speak, not to backtrack from anything he'd said. "I am embarrassed," he admitted honestly. "But I meant every word of it. I don't think anything I said in that waiting room was wrong, even knowing now who I was saying it to." Something shifted subtly in Whitney's expression, a flicker of genuine respect crossing behind her composed features. "That's actually the answer I was hoping you'd give," she said. "Most candidates, once they realize who I actually am, immediately start walking back anything remotely candid they said beforehand, terrified of having offended me. You didn't do that." She leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him with renewed interest. "Tell me honestly, Marcus, the thing you said about layoffs and communication. Did you mean that, or were you just making conversation with a stranger?" "I meant it completely," Marcus said, steadier now, some of his earlier mortification settling into something closer to quiet resolve. "I watched 40 people, myself included, get reduced to a paragraph in a mass email after years of solid work. If I ever manage a team, I'd want every single person to hear directly from a person, not a policy, if their role was ever at risk. People deserve that basic respect, especially during the worst professional moment of their year." Whitney nodded slowly, making a small note on the pad in front of her, though Marcus couldn't see what she'd written. The formal portion of the interview continued for another 40 minutes, Whitney asking sharp, detailed questions about Marcus's decade of logistics coordination experience, his approach to managing distribution bottlenecks, his specific strategies for handling supply chain disruptions under pressure. Marcus answered each question thoroughly, drawing on real examples from his career, gradually settling into the same steady confidence that had carried him through a decade of genuinely solid professional work, even as the earlier embarrassment lingered somewhere in the back of his mind. Near the end of the interview, Whitney set down her pen and studied Marcus directly. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "This role reports directly to me, overseeing our entire logistics restructuring as we scale operations over the next 18 months. It requires someone who understands not just supply chain mechanics, but how to treat people fairly during periods of major organizational change, which, candidly, is exactly the quality you demonstrated completely by accident in my own lobby this morning." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in 8 months of relentless financial anxiety. "I appreciate you saying that," he said carefully, unwilling to assume anything after the morning's earlier lesson in unwarranted assumptions. Whitney smiled, the same warm expression from the lobby now fully unguarded. "I built this company because I watched my own father get laid off from a factory job with less dignity than a form letter, back when I was about your daughter's age," she said. "It's part of why this role exists at all. I need someone running logistics who won't let that happen here. You spent 20 minutes proving, without knowing you were being evaluated, that you're exactly that person." Marcus was offered the position of logistics operations manager 3 days later, following a final reference check that came back, as Whitney later told him with a small, knowing smile, "exactly as candid and consistent as everything you told me directly." He accepted immediately, the relief of finally securing stable income arriving alongside a genuine excitement he hadn't felt about a job in years, driven not just by the paycheck but by the specific mission Whitney had described during their final conversation. Maya, when Marcus told her the news that evening over dinner, asked immediately whether the CEO had been mad about the mix-up in the lobby. Marcus laughed genuinely for the first time in months. "Turns out," he told her, "the most honest thing I ever accidentally did was give career advice to my future boss without knowing it. She said that's exactly why she hired me. Maya considered this seriously for a moment before delivering her own verdict. With the particular blunt wisdom 9-year-olds sometimes manage. So basically, you got the job by being yourself and not knowing it mattered yet, she said. Marcus nodded slowly, struck by how precisely his daughter had summarized the entire morning. 6 months into the role, Marcus led the redesign of Halden Innovation's internal communication protocol for organizational changes, ensuring that any future restructuring, however necessary for the company's growth, would involve direct individual conversations rather than mass form emails, a policy Whitney specifically credited in a company-wide meeting to a conversation she'd had in the lobby with a job candidate who didn't yet know he was talking to his future CEO. Marcus, sitting quietly in that meeting alongside colleagues who now knew the full story, felt a version of pride he hadn't experienced in years, rooted not in any single accomplishment, but in the simple, steady consistency of being exactly who he was, whether or not anyone important happened to be listening. Whitney and Marcus developed a genuine, mutually respectful working relationship over the following year, one occasionally punctuated by Whitney's fond habit of reminding him, usually in front of new hires during onboarding, that the company's current head of logistics had once given her unsolicited interview advice without recognizing his own boss. Marcus took the good-natured teasing with the same steady grace he'd brought to that first mortifying conference room conversation, understanding by then that the story had become something closer to a company legend than an embarrassment proof, retold regularly to new employees that honesty rarely needs to know exactly who's listening in order to matter. Marcus eventually paid off the mortgage payment that had loomed so heavily over that Tuesday morning interview, and many more after it, building a stable new chapter for himself and Maya that felt, for the first time since Denise's passing, genuinely secure rather than merely survived. He kept, tucked into his desk drawer at Halden Innovations, a small handwritten note Whitney had given him during his first week a single line reading, "Some of the best hires happen by accident. Don't ever stop being exactly who you were in that lobby, a quiet daily reminder that the version of himself he'd been most afraid of that morning turned out to be precisely the version worth keeping. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, make sure you're subscribed, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share it with someone who still believes honesty matters even when you don't know who's listening. Because somewhere out there today, someone is about to accidentally give career advice to their future boss, with absolutely no idea how much it's about to change everything.